investigated and wrote an article about each one. So that was for the root.com. All right. So what did you all think about that that documentary that was shown? African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. What did you think? It's Crystal, right?
Yeah.
What did you think, Crystal?
Well, I thought it was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
There was some things in there I probably would have questioned.
Sure, like what? Give me an example. And then I'll give you some background information.
Well, they said some of the first black people to set foot on this country.
Sure.
I think he said it was 15 something.
Well, he talked about Juan Garrido in 1513. So Juan Garrido comes into Florida in 1513 with Juan Ponce de Leon, the Spanish conquistador.
Right.
Juan Garrido is a former African slave. So this,
right.
He said this is the first African we know by name. Okay, so this is before Jamestown, Virginia, August 20th, 1619.
Right.
The Spanish, in this land, the Spanish are involved in the transatlantic slave trade before the English get involved. Mm-hmm. So the Spanish are involved, and really to understand this history, you have to understand the 800-year history of the Africans known as the Moors in Europe, because this precipitates all this. Mm-hmm. It's the Moors that are going to reintroduce the concept of longitude and latitude. They're going to introduce spherical globes, almanacs into Europe, mm-hmm. so that these Europeans can sail. When you study Columbus, Columbus had Moors navigating some of his ships. Okay, so now let me just give a disclaimer. Number one, I may say some things that are outside the circumference of your own awareness. Just because you may disagree with them or don't like them does not mean they're not true. It just means you have to do some research to understand what I'm talking about. So I've seen a whole 6-part series. Mm-hmm. There's also a companion book that Gates put out called African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross that people should read as well. So this project came about, it consists of 70 stories that people submitted to him, and he went and researched these stories dealing with the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so now this is a good documentary, but there's some problems with it. So it's good to watch the documentary, but then you have to study some additional history, and you have to understand Gates. Okay, so Gates is really, and this is not an attack on Gates, but this is true. He's an apologist for Europeans. Okay, so Gates can get funding from white corporations to do documentaries like this, because Gates argues that Africans were equally culpable in the transatlantic slave trade, and he tries to absolve Europeans of any responsibility for paying reparations. Right. So if you go and look at the New York Times op-ed article he wrote in 2010 called "Ending the Slavery Blame Game," this is what that article did. So I did an interview with one of my teachers, Dr. Linda Jeffries, one of our Grandmaster Scholar Warriors, after that article came out, because we challenged that article, and then also Dr. Molefi Kete Asante, who's the chair of the Afro-American Studies Department at Temple University, he wrote a rebuttal article called "Henry Louis Gates is Wrong About African Involvement in the Slave Trade." You can read that article at his website, asante.net. Okay, so when I teach about the transatlantic slave trade, that's one of the articles that I cite, because what Asante does is he says that what Gates does is he takes exceptions to the rule and tries to extrapolate that over the history of the transatlantic slave trade and say that Africans were equally culpable. That's not true. Asante asked the question: who built the ships and sailed to Africa to capture African people and enslave them? Who owned the insurance companies that took out insurance policies on not just the slave ships, but also on Africans on the slave ships? Okay, who organized themselves into slave trading companies? The Dutch West India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Brandenburg Company. These were slave trading companies financed by Europeans who had money. Okay, so the transatlantic slave trade didn't just pop out of nowhere. This was heavily financed. Okay, he talks about the Asiento, which was in the Spanish colonies, and this was permission in the Spanish colonies for people to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, things like this. So when you actually read this article by Molefi Kete Asante, he breaks this down and dismantles Gates' argument. But the reason why Gates can get funding from like Bank of America to do his documentaries is because that's his argument. Now that does not mean that there's not good information in there that you can learn from. You can. but you have to understand the overall context in the game he's playing. Okay, so it's important. It's important to understand that.
So the guy, just to finalize that question though, that was the first black person that they could put a name to, because there were black people. Moors were here.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So based upon my research, that's probably the earliest one by name.
Okay.
So you have the Africans known as the Moors who were here. You have the Khoisan, who I talked about last Friday, who have the oldest DNA on the planet. They come from southern Africa. Okay, they're the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. The Twa are derisively called pygmies in European anthropology and archaeology, things like this. The Twa were here going back at least 51,700 years ago. And there was a discovery made in Allendale County, South Carolina in 2004 by Dr. Albert Goodyear, who's an archaeologist at the University of South Carolina, to document that. There's a strong African presence here, and the African presence from ancient Egypt or Kemet here as well. Okay, there were pyramid mounds up and down the Mississippi River.
Isn't
so
Mountain Road supposed to be one?
Well, I've heard that. I don't know for example. I don't know that for sure.
Okay.
But there is a street in Detroit called Blackmore Street. Okay, so there was a strong presence in this land of African people. And the other thing, and I'll go to the next question. Christopher Columbus never came to this land we call the United States of America. This is something we have to understand. Columbus, the closest he came here was Cuba, which is 90 miles away. So when I do my presentations, and I'll talk about this on the 16th when we do the Middle Passage ceremony, when you look at where Columbus went on his 4 voyages, he goes into Central America, he goes into the Caribbean, he goes into South America, Haiti, and Jamaica. Jamaica, 1494. It's Columbus that uncovers Jamaica. Okay, it's Columbus that goes into Haiti. Okay, so when they talk about the Haitian Revolution that starts in 1791, that was Spanish territory first. So you're going to see these Europeans constantly fighting over these new lands that they're discovering also. I saw a hand, this sister back here.
Yeah,
go
just
to the back.
very quickly.
Yeah.
So I understand that you disagree with Gates' characterization of African involvement in the slave trade. So how would you characterize the relationship between the Africans and their involvement with the Europeans in terms of facilitating the slave trade?
Africans fought every step of the way, and there's a good book by Dr. Sylvia Diouf, D-I-O-U-F, called Fighting the Slave Trade, which documents how Africans fought every step of the way. Now, all people have had collaborators. All people have had traitors. If you watch the documentary, 500 years later, or 500 years, it's Dr. Molefi, Kete, Asante in there, Dr. Maulana Karenga, who co-founded Kwanzaa. They talk about how all people have had traitors. All people have had collaborators, but we're the only ones who get blamed for our own Holocaust because of traitors. Okay, I'm sorry, yes.
No, go ahead.
Okay, see, we're the only ones who get blamed. There were Native American traitors. There were, motion detector. There were Native American traitors, collaborators, things like this. So that always happens, but African people fought every step of the way. So when he talks about, when he says that Africans practiced slavery, that's not exactly true. Africans had a cultural servitude system. Africans had a cultural servitude system. And if you were a prisoner of war, if you committed a crime or something like that, you were in debt. There was a cultural servitude system. But you were not in that for perpetuity. Your humanity, in general, your humanity was respected. And also your children were not born into that.
Right.
What Europeans inflicted upon Africans had never been seen before in history. Because previously, that different cultures had slavery. But it was different than the chattel slavery that Europeans inflicted upon us. One, it was based upon race.
Right.
Two, it was for perpetuity. Okay. Three, you were dehumanized and your humanity was stripped away and you were a piece of chattel, a piece of property. Okay. So what was inflicted upon us was totally different.
Right.
Okay. And then the brother had a question back there, and then we'll go back to counsel in a while. Yes, brother.
Okay, so they called us only by our first name. So basically, the names we have now are slave names.
Yeah.
In general, yeah, they were. So usually when someone is either bought or born onto a plantation to a slave owner, they usually take that slave owner's last name in general. They may refer to them by a first name, but they are a piece of property, and that last name denoted property. That last name denoted that they were a piece of property. Also, they were usually branded. So if they ran away, they could be identified who they belonged to as well. So the slaves were usually branded as well.
So the only way we can find out through our genealogy is through that DNA?
You can do DNA. If you do DNA, you do AfricanAncestry.com. Because AfricanAncestry.com can not only tell you what region in Africa you're from, they can tell you also the high culture, the tribe that you're from, whether you're Asante, Wolof, Ndebele, they can actually do that. So they're more precise. AfricanAncestry.com.
AfricanAncestry.com.
Yeah, now that's a little more expensive, but because when you do like the other ones, they'll tell you you're from West Africa. Okay, well that's I can tell you probably that without even doing it. Okay, you're most likely from West Africa. Now, about 20% of African Americans have an ancestry that go back to Angola and the Congo. So they weren't just taking them from West Africa. So if you look at Louisiana has a prison there called Angola Prison. Why is it called Angola Prison? Because the prison is on the land that used to be a slave plantation. And most of the slaves on that plantation came from Angola. That's why it's called Angola Prison. So they weren't just taking them from West Africa. Okay? Other question. Councilwoman Watley, yes.
The things that he says, because I've always considered him sort of a gatekeeper, but
He is, yeah. He's a big gatekeeper,
he's
yeah.
a gatekeeper.
Yeah, he is.
But him speaking about, because you hear a lot of white people say, well, black people enslaved them, their own people and stuff like that.
So he starts out with Anthony Johnson,
Right.
which is really, really problematic.
Yeah.
You got to understand Gates in the game he plays. And this is not to beat up on anybody in an interracial relationship. He's also married to a white woman as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he brags about being 56% white. So you have to understand Gates' history because, like some of my teachers, like Dr. Linda Jeffries, they call him Dr. Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates. Because oftentimes he skips over the truth. That's what they call him. Because his nickname is Skip. They call him Skip Gates, and all the white historians, so they call him Dr. Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates. Go ahead.
And he did think he had special dispensation until the police came to his house.
Right, exactly.
And he got treated just the way he did. But that's another point altogether.
Yep.
I'm talking about the fact that people always, just like you were saying, speak of us monolithically. Like one size fits all.
Right.
If you do it, I do it. What they have to understand is when they're talking about this light-colored people enslaving each other, that's no difference than Protestants and Catholics, in Ireland or something. They're acting like
they're fighting each other for hundreds of years.
They're acting like this is half these tribes didn't even know the other tribes. Is that correct?
Well, what happened was when we look at the continent of Africa, African people did not see themselves all as one people.
Right.
These were different ethnic groups, or what we call tribes. It's just like Europeans. Right. Europeans have been fighting each other for hundreds of years. Yes. Okay, you studied the European War, you studied the Vandals and the Visigoths, crushing the western portion of the Roman Empire, 476 AD. This is what cast Europe into the Dark Ages. And then when you study Europe coming out of the Dark Ages, and they're going into so the Portuguese start with the transatlantic slave trade about 1440 to 1441. The Spanish are right behind them because Spain and Portugal are right next to each other. These Europeans are constantly fighting one another for these new lands that they're discovering because they're trying to extract wealth out of these new lands, set up plantations, and rebuild their respective countries. Okay, because they're coming out of the Black Death, the bubonic plague. It hits in 1347 AD. It hits in spurts from 1347 to 1400. So Europe loses 1/4 to 1/3 of their population. Europe is devastated. So when we look at the sugarcane plantations that the Europeans are going to set up, especially with the Spanish in Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, the Moors had introduced sugar into Europe. And a lot of Europeans had gotten hooked on sugar. So when Columbus is set sail on his 4 voyages, he's not just looking for another route to Asia, okay? He's not just looking for spices, he's also looking for another source of sugar. This is why they're setting up these large sugar cane plantations. And even today in Cuba, sugar cane is one of the top exports, or sugar is one of the top exports out of Cuba. That goes back to that history dealing with the Spanish and slavery. Okay, so we can still see the remains and the remnants and things like this of the transatlantic slave trade in history today.
and in the way that they still today think of us as monolithic, like baby's mamas, you know?
Baby's mama,
like
right.
white people don't have baby's mamas.
Right, no. And that comes from it largely being promoted in the media. So when I was in school, so I'm 47, right? So when I was in school, like say in the 80s, right? Girls would write on their notebook, they wanted to, they write their name and Michael Jackson's name or their name and Prince. They wanted to be Prince's wife. They wanted to be Michael Jackson's wife. They wanted to be Elder Barge's wife. Nobody said they wanted to be a baby's mama. No girl said, I want to grow up, I want to be a baby's mama. No, they didn't say that, okay? They wanted to be the wife or at the very least the girlfriend. Nobody was talking about being a side chick, okay? So let's look at what happens, right? 1997, and this is why media is so important. I've been studying media 27 years.
Right.
1997, you have a pretty much one-hit wonder group called B-Rock and the Beats. They come out with a song that goes to number 3 on Billboard Top 100 called That's Just My Baby's Daddy.
That's just my baby daddy.
Yeah, okay, who that is? That's just my baby's daddy. Prior to that, you would hear this term, but it wasn't a phenomenon. It wasn't something that women wanted to aspire to be. Okay, and the song talks about babies' daddies, and then what goes along with that is babies' mamas, right? And then you have the song by Outkast, Miss Jackson. It talks about babies' mamas, babies' daddies, things like this. So what happens is you have these words that get pushed into the vernacular, and along with those words comes a mentality. Okay, so even today, so people sometimes you may hear the term wifey, right? So about 2000 or so, the group Next had a song called Wifey. That's where that really comes from. That it becomes popular. So when you look at where these terms come from, you see a lot of it is pushed into the culture from the music. This is why we have to fight against negative corporate control with hip hop.
Right.
Because conscious hip hop was purposely taken over by corporate conglomerates to send the culture and the music in a different direction because it was waking up the conscious level of our youth. Okay, so when you understand the games that are being played, you can fight against it. This is why I tell parents and grandparents, you got to go to azlyrics.com and read the lyrics of the songs that your children are listening to, so you can understand the program. Because you can't fight what you don't understand. You got to listen to Cardi B, you got to listen to Nicki Minaj, Lil Wayne, all of that to understand the program. Okay, once we understand the program, and then we can fight against it. Any other questions? I thought I saw another hand. Did I answer your question in the back, brother? You had your hand up. Did I answer you had a question?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I couldn't remember. Okay. All right, yeah. So this is good. This is good to watch African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. It's important to understand the history prior to what Gates is talking about. And he talked about Anthony Johnson in the beginning, right? So Anthony Johnson was this African American who was going to have white indentured servants, and I think he had more than one African slave. But what Gates doesn't talk about are the massive land giveaways that take place during the colonial time. About 100,000 acres of land that George Washington gets, and about something like 70,000 acres of land that Thomas Jefferson gets. He doesn't deal with the massive land giveaways that take place in this country. Okay, so this land was, before Europeans got here, this land was owned by African people and Native Americans. You're going to hear a lot about black Indians. When you study, if you read Dr. David Imhotep's book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence, around page 67, he talks about Captain John Smith in Jamestown, Virginia, talking about being captured by a group of black Indians. Okay? So what Gates doesn't deal with is how this land was stolen. All right? And then, he may talk about it later, then you have about somewhere around 400 million acres of land that's given away starting in 1862 with the Homestead Act of 1862. And that gives away about 250 million acres of land to white people and immigrants coming to this country. This is the second year of World War II. Then in 1866, right after the Civil War ends, you have the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which gives away about 45 million acres of land. Then in 1887, you have the Dawes Allotment Act, D-A-W-E-S. The Dawes Allotment Act gives away another 3,800 million acres of land. And most of that land was supposed to go to black Indians and African Americans and Native Americans. 2/3 go to white people, right? So you have this total maldistribution of wealth, power, and resources. And this is, we're still feeling the effects of that today. Okay, we're still feeling the effects of that today. So these are things that this is why we have to understand that chronology of history and understand how this is dealing with the fight for scarce wealth, power, and resources.
Is it similar to, what is it, Special Order 15?
Special Order 15?
Where the 40 acres in the mule
Yes, so
came
that was Special Order number 15, January 16, 1865, General William T. Sherman. So that was land in, it was in South Carolina, Georgia, coastal land, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And it was about 400,000 acres of land. About 400,000 acres of land in those areas. Those were given to former slaves, okay, after slavery ends. And most of that land was taken back. President Andrew Johnson takes back most of that land, and he gives a blanket pardon to the Southerners who joined the Confederacy, because they committed treason against the government. He gave a blanket pardon to them, and he was sympathetic to the Southern plantation owners, and he took back most of that land and gave it back. Yeah. And now you still have some who have that land, the Gullah in South Carolina and the Geechee in Georgia. Okay, you have those coastal lands, so some of them still hold their land, but their land is being taken away from them also, and they're descendants of Africans who come from West Africa, the Gullah and the Geechee.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that there is a need for reparations or repairing the damage that's been done.
Right. Right. And if we get reparations, number one, the majority of it should not be in the form of money.
No.
Because if we all got $1 million a day, Europeans will have it all back this time next week, number one. Okay. Two, we need to study the Black Freedmen Indian treaties of 1866, because many of the arguments for reparations are not legal arguments, they're moral arguments.
Right.
And you don't go to a legal court to make a moral argument. They're not making legal arguments. We have to make a legal argument. Right. So when we deal with, and this ties into the land giveaways, right? African people worked the land for 246 years, largely for free, 1619 to 1865. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that we had in this country from 1619 to 1865. Okay, there's a book by James Newton and I think Ronald Lewis called The Other Slaves, and it deals with all the skills, trades, and crafts, the engineers and the basket makers, barrel makers, barbers, blacksmiths, coppersmiths. All these skills were used to build this country. Okay, so a lot of people make the argument. They say, well, we were slaves for 246 years and didn't get paid, so you owe us $15 trillion, right? So that the reason why that's not going to work and hasn't been paid is because when you study the history of slavery, unfortunately, you weren't supposed to get paid. That was the whole purpose.
Says who?
That was the whole purpose. It was legal. It was legal to enslave them. It was legal not to pay them.
Right.
It's not like there was a slave union that negotiated wages for us, and then the slave master agreed to pay the wages, and then when Friday came to get paid, they didn't pay. That's not what happened.
But this was decided by some thieves who came to the country.
I understand that.
Anyway, so they made up the rules and law.
I understand that, but I'm getting to a point. We have to make a clear distinction between a legal argument and a moral argument. It was morally wrong what happened, but it was legal. Now, March 2nd, 1807, U.S. Congress passes a law that outlaws the international slave trade based upon a 20-year clause in the U.S. Constitution. That law goes into effect January 1st, 1808, okay? Which means all the Africans that came into this country after January 1st, 1808, they were brought here illegally based upon the country's own laws. Now you have more of a legal argument. Prior to that, it was totally legal. This is why I tell people, all this stuff is based upon law. So if you're gonna try to pass legislation, which is law, to pay reparations, you have to have a legal argument. We see one of the reasons why these arguments have failed is because we're making moral arguments and not legal arguments. To make a legal argument, you have to understand law. They violated their own laws. So when the Clotilda, the last slave ship, comes to this country in 1860, and this is how you get the interview that Zora Neale Hurston did for her lost manuscript called Barracoon that was just released last year, and she interviews Cudjoe Lewis. Cudjoe Lewis was one of those Africans that was brought from Africa on that last slave ship into Alabama in 1860. That was totally illegal. That's human trafficking. They're violating the U.S. Congress own law, federal government own law. So now you have a legal argument from January 1st, 1808 up until 1860. Prior to that, it's totally legal. The second real legal argument, and it's even a stronger legal argument because there's a precedence for this, are the Black Freedmen Indian treaties of 1866. So the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans, they all own black slaves. Yep. They all own African slaves. And you see them involved in the Indian Removal Act of 1830 when President Andrew Jackson, okay, who's a hero of Donald Trump, there's a whole nother conversation, right? President Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And they want to take this land in southeastern United States, Alabama, Georgia, these areas, from these Native American tribes. They send them all out west, over 1,000 miles. They go into Oklahoma, on what's known as the Trail of Tears. When they go into Oklahoma, they take their black slaves with them. When we studied Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma was founded by Creek Indians around 1836 who got pushed off their land in southeastern United States and go on the Trail of Tears. They take their African slaves into Tulsa. Tulsa was originally called Tallahassee. Tallahassee is a Creek Indian word. The word Tulsa comes from Tallahassee. When the Civil War comes, 1861 to 1865, those 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans all fight on behalf of the South to keep slavery intact, keep it in place because they all own slaves. When they did this and they took up arms against the Union, they violated their treaties that they had with the U.S. Okay? So they didn't know that the treaty stated they could never take up arms against the Union. Prior to the Civil War, Native Americans had Indian territories. After the Civil War ends, that land's going to be taken away. They put on Indian reservations. Right. But the treaties, the Black Freedmen Indian treaties that were signed between these Native American tribes and the U.S. government stipulated that they, one, free all their slaves, because even after the Civil War ended, some of these Native American groups didn't want to turn their slaves free. So it stipulated they had to free their slaves. The Native Americans were given land, but the former slaves that belonged to these tribes, they get land also. Okay, they're going to get, in many cases, 150 acres of land. And when you study the early African American landowners in Tulsa, Oklahoma, many of those black people got their land from those treaties because they were former slaves of the Creek Indians. Okay, you have one girl named Sarah Rector. Sarah Rector was known as an Afro-American girl in 1913, and she was known as the richest Afro-American girl in the country. Sarah Rector, oil is discovered in Tulsa around 1905. Sarah Rector got land from these Indian treaties because her family was of former Creek slave ancestry. She gets land from these treaties, and oil is discovered on her land. So she becomes a multimillionaire because of the oil on her land that she was given because of these treaties. So we were pushed, so some of our ancestors got land, got compensation, things like this from these treaties. But we were pushed out of those treaties in 1941. So many of us don't know these treaties exist. Those treaties are still being enforced for the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians today. They're getting free college tuition, free taxes, casino licenses, radio station licenses, TV station licenses. They're getting all types of benefits from those treaties. But we don't know that they exist, so we don't know to fight for those. So that's probably the best. That's probably your best chance to get any type of reparations, because some of our ancestors were already in those treaties getting compensation, and we got pushed out. So we have to understand history and law to understand what to fight for.
We had to be a slave of one of those, or we...
Either slave or freedman. So you're going to have Africans who marry into those Native American families and become part of the nation. Mm-hmm. So when they go on the Trail of Tears, you have some enslaved Africans with them, and you have other African Americans or African people who are freedmen, and they're part of those Native American nations also. Okay, so they got compensation, okay, as well as the former slaves.
Wasn't there something a short time ago where all the Indians disavowed any knowledge of having these blacks?
The Cherokee Nation in 2011 stripped all the descendants of the black freedmen of their full rights in the Cherokee Nation, and the descendants of the black freedmen sued and they won their case. This is like maybe back in 2016, they won their case, and their full citizenship in those nations and their full rights were restored. Yeah, but the Cherokee stripped the descendants of the black freedmen. Yeah.
No, one other question. Oh, did somebody else have a question? No. Oh, just one other question, and
Sure.
it's in reference to the moral versus legal argument.
Sure.
We always deal in morality as opposed to, that basic you can't argue with this fact thing.
Right. Now, who's we?
We're talking black people.
Right, okay.
Generally go through the emotional process.
Well, we're very spiritual people.
Huh?
But we're very spiritual people. But if you're dealing with a government and you're trying to get them to pass laws or something, we have to understand the difference between morality and law.
Right.
So we have to understand how to make a legal argument.
Because we go through the motions of saying that's not right.
Correct,
Nobody
right.
cares. if
Right,
you
exactly.
think
We have to
that's
understand the
not
difference
right.
between morality and law.
You have to have something specific, because, I mean, look at the fact, who was it Thomas Jefferson that railed against impressment for white men on boats and stuff like that?
What do you mean?
He thought, when people would get shanghaied and stuff. you
Okay.
know, and he said that impressment was one of the worst things, it was wrong, yet he had hundreds of thousands of slaves.
Well,
But
not
if you
not hundreds of
think
thousands,
that
but yeah, he owned about 600 slaves, yeah.
Yeah,
And he had a
okay.
relationship with one, a complicated relationship, yeah. One, he had children by her, Sally
Yes,
Hemings.
Sally.
Right.
Yes.
And he's one who got thousands of acres of land, somewhere about 75,000 acres of land, because before the American Revolutionary War, which starts in 1775, you having millions of acres of land being given away to white men coming to this country, okay? Because these were British colonies. The reason why these were British colonies, it wasn't because people were coming here for religious freedom, is because these were colonies set up to create more wealth for Great Britain, to produce, to take control of the land, to plant crops, to produce things that Great Britain could sell. That's what that was set up for. But when you have the American Revolution, these colonialists, these white men, they wanted to have more control over the wealth that they were producing and being produced by the slaves. They wanted to have more control over that. So they're rebelling against King George III, because that's who was the king of England. His wife was Queen Charlotte Sophia, who was of African descent. Queen Charlotte Sophia, she was the wife of King George III during the American Revolution. That they don't want to talk a whole lot about.
No, they never do.
Do you think most of us can, I'm talking about that reparations part back. Most of us probably, if we had the tools and the knowledge, could get in on that Choctaw Creek and
You have to research your ancestry. For many of us, it would not apply. But what can happen is, first and foremost, what can happen is through tracing your ancestry and seeing if your ancestors were part of that or have that ancestry. Because I had Cherokee on my mother's side. Okay, my great grandfather on my mother's side was Cherokee, and his wife was Black Crow and African American. So what happens is there's going to be a smaller amount of us who will qualify for that because of our ancestry. My argument would be, once that is obtained, then it should be spread out to all African Americans. Okay, but you have to start somewhere. There's a legal precedence for that because some of our ancestors were in those treaties as documented, and they were getting compensation. They were getting free. They were getting land. Okay, so here you have a precedence for your legal argument. All right. So and the other thing is, if you understand strategy, when you start talking about reparations, then you got to argue with white people who don't understand history. Okay, I'm not into arguing with white people who don't understand history. Let's deal with precedents. Let's deal with law, okay? And you can deal directly with the government because that compensation, that land was coming from the government. So you bypass the argument with the Donald Trump supporters and all this other stuff. Because if you go back to about 2010, when you had the stimulus package from President Obama, in the stimulus package, there was almost $200 million in reparations for Filipino Americans. And it had to do with World War II. and Filipino Americans serving in World War II. If you go research that, they got almost $200 million in reparations. There was nobody complaining about that and talking about that, right? It was in there, bam, and it was paid out, right? They're dealing with the government. They're not dealing with Rush Limbaugh radio listeners. You have to understand strategy. So that's why, I don't just talk reparation. I talk strategy because I don't have time to argue with ignorant white people. I'm sorry. I can educate them, but I ain't got time to argue with them. I'm sorry, I saw a hand.
Yeah, never mind. Nobody wants.
And I don't mean to disrespect anybody, but I don't have time for that. I'm sorry. And if they understood their history, they would stop supporting Trump. Because Trump has never been for poor white people. He's screwing them over. They don't realize this. They don't the whole concept of white in the British colonies was designed to break up the alliance between indentured English servants and enslaved Africans. Because there was an alliance. You study Bacon's Rebellion in 1675 and 1676 in the colony of Virginia. And they united because they had a common enemy who was exploiting both of them, the plantation owners, things like this. They were exploiting both of them, right? So they united. And so after that, it's going to be in the late 1600s that they introduced the term white in the British colonies to separate them. Okay, so then they're gonna give them a little land, and they're gonna make them think they're part of the white family. So you're gonna wear the uniform, right? But you're gonna sit on the bench. You're not gonna play in the game. And many of them still haven't figured this trick out today.
Did they set the black people and the Native Americans against each other too?
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Because back to the Choctaw. My
Okay.
mother's father was Choctaw.
Mhm.
He lived on a reservation in Mississippi.
Okay.
Her brothers thought they were better than him.
Okay.
Because he couldn't own land.
Mm-hmm.
There were some things that I guess this treaty he got, I don't know, but
Right.
they couldn't own land.
Right.
And so the black people thought that they were better than him. She had a couple kids by this guy.
The black people thought they were better than he because he was Choctaw?
On a reservation.
Oh, he was on a reservation.
Right.
Well, you're going to have these different games that people play. So when you understand white supremacy always pits groups of oppressed people against each other to keep fighting one another. It's the same thing Trump is doing and targeting Mexicans and Hispanics and saying they're flooding the borders. Well, undocumented crossings at the Mexican border is about almost 20-year low. Most undocumented immigrants don't run through the border. They come here legally on visas and they overstay their visas. Trump is not talking about that. A wall is not going to stop that. A wall is not going to stop the tunnels that are running underneath Mexico and the United States where they're bringing drugs in. Since 1990, there's an article from CBSNews.com. Since 1990, there have been about 230 underground tunnels discovered by Border Patrol. Okay? The wall don't have nothing to do with that. So what Trump is doing is when you understand white supremacy, they always try to blame somebody for all the problems. During slavery, they said you had some abolitionists who said the slaves need to be set free because the slaves are taking people's jobs. Well, it's not like we volunteered for this, right? It's not like we volunteered to come here and to just work for free. We were put into that predicament, okay? But you had African slaves who were blamed for taking people's jobs. When the Civil War was fought, and you study the South, the question we should ask ourselves is, wait a second, most of the white men who fought on behalf of the South in the Civil War were poor. The majority of them, okay? Most of them didn't own slaves. So how is it that they were convinced to take up arms, to risk their lives, to fight for the Confederacy, to fight for the rich, wealthy plantation owner? Well, because the rich plantation owner told them if the slaves are free, they're going to take your jobs. They already had your jobs and they were doing it for free. They didn't figure that out. They thought they were part of the white family. They got manipulated. They thought they were part of the white family. So they went out and risked their lives to fight to maintain the Confederacy, okay, and to protect the Confederate way of life and protect slavery, okay? And they haven't figured it out. They still haven't figured it out. I know we had to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But she has a question, David.
Yes, sister.
That's the same way that number 45 is doing today
Absolutely.
by saying make
America great again.
Absolutely.
You know, that's how he got all of the poor white people
Absolutely.
to come out and vote.
They haven't figured it out. And if you just look at what happened with the government shutdown, right? Number one, a lot of those people that voted for him didn't get a paycheck for a month. Number two, the federal contractors, there are 1.2 million of them, they won't get any back pay. Federal contractors do not get back pay. Some of them voted for him. And my thing is, wait a second, while he was, during the government shutdown, while he's trying to advocate for a wall that he lied and said Mexico was going to pay for, and he's holding 800,000 federal workers hostage, he has undocumented immigrants working at his golf course in New Jersey and New York.
That's right.
This guy's the biggest con I've ever seen in my life. My degree's in business administration from Wayne State University. We study fraud. We study cons. I've never seen anything like this
That's
before.
right. And the Border Patrol was not getting paid.
Right.
During the
Not
shutdown.
only that, the FBI wasn't getting paid. So when 29 FBI agents went to Roger Stone's house,
That's right.
6 a.m. in the morning and knocked on the door,
That's
FBI,
right.
they weren't getting paid either.
That's right.
Right.
So the Border Patrol, the Coast Guard, the FBI, all these government entities, they weren't getting paid because of one person. This is an example of how elections have consequences. This is what I tried to tell people in 2016 before the election. I warned people about Trump. People didn't want to listen. So I know we have to wrap up. Take one of my pamphlets. I have my DVD lectures over here. And we have a bundle pack. You get 6 of my presentations for
Imhotep
$50.
will be
Yes.
Friday at Smith Chapel.
You take one.
It will be Friday at Smith Chapel.
Yeah, for part two of this.
Of the,
Is it Thursday or Friday,
6
Mom?
o'clock.
It's Friday.
No, it's Friday. Thursday is, maybe we have to change because it's the state of the city. But he will be there
Yeah.
Friday.
Friday,
Thank you
yep.
so much.
No
Once
problem.
again,
And then all the DVDs are on sale. This helps support the African History Network, helps us to stay on air, keep broadcasting, pay the